My name is John Wright. I am one of the publication editors with the PLR-LR. And our last panel is Healthy Forests, Healthy Economies. It's been alluded to in many of the other panels here this weekend, or week. To my left is Craig Rollins. He is the president of the Forest Business Network, and he will be moderating for us today. Then we have Tom Power. He is a professor here at UM of resource economics. And to the left, we have Dan Kemmis, author and former director of the Center for the Rocky Mountain West. And then we have John Gatchell, conservation director from the Montana Wilderness Association. And finally, we have Leslie Weldon, who reworked her schedule to be here today. She's the regional forester, the Forest Service for the northern region. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here today in front of this esteemed panel and all of you in the audience that are have an interest in healthy forest and healthy economy. Healthy forest, healthy economy, I'm very interested in that myself. I'm a practitioner of that. And here in the last few days, kind of getting ready for this conference, I was thinking about the last month, breathing in smoke, looking at a very hazy view shed, and hearing on the news that Missoula High School events had to be moved to towns with cleaner air because of all the smoke. Caught me to thinking that besides healthy forests, healthy economy, maybe we should be adding healthy air, healthy people, animals to our discussion today. Besides the information our panels have prepared to present, I'd like to challenge them to consider commenting on how they think we might use some human ingenuity and resources to have healthy forest, healthy economy, healthy air, healthy people, and healthy animals. I think they all tie together. Our panelists are going to go today in the order they're on the program, so I'd like you to help me welcome our first speaker, Tom Power.
Okay. All right, let me apologize to start with for not having been at the rest of the conference. I'm sort of a poacher jumping in here at the tail end. I was off at a different conference in northern Wisconsin dealing with another hot issue, namely sulfide copper mining in the western Lake Superior area, and just got back in town yesterday. I also, if there's any people from the School of Forestry left here, should apologize for the title I ended up being given. I'm actually a research professor in the economics department and professor emeritus, not a natural resource economist, although I've spent the last almost 45 years now studying the role of natural resources in the Montana economy. And in that sense, my field of study has been the boundary between natural resources and healthy economies. One of the things that worries me is reflected in the title of this panel. Besides it, in fact, giving us some guidance as to what we are supposed to talk about, I think the Healthy Forest, Healthy Economy title also suggests a familiar but misleading and costly, if not dangerous, bumper sticker slogan that worries me. It suggests that our forests in general are unhealthy and that timber harvest or other mechanical vegetative treatment employed to reestablish their health will make a major contribution to local economies. In general, I think that neither of these is correct. The focus on the healthy economy part of the title or slogan represents a return to earlier justifications for below-cost timber sales and high levels of timber harvest. Such activities, it was assumed, would stabilize rural communities. The Forest Service promoted the construction of new mills in areas such as southwest Montana, where an export-oriented commercial timber industry had never previously existed. None of those mills survived very long. They came and went, destabilizing communities instead of stabilizing them. Also, the Forest Service's efforts to provide a steady flow of timber to local mills, regardless of lumber market conditions, also destabilized communities by driving lumber prices down further when lumber markets were weak and driving them up higher when lumber markets were strong. The healthy economy part linked to healthy forests also is tied to the assumption that those forests play a very important role in the overall economy. The relative importance of the forest products industry in the Montana economy in the past and in the present has been regularly exaggerated to support emergency intervention to protect a central, key, important component of the Montana economy. It's important to understand the actual importance and likely future importance when promoting subsidies to boost timber harvest levels on federal lands. A good example of the exaggeration that's possible, the unlimited exaggeration that's possible, can be found in an article in the Wednesday New York Times with a byline to Boulder, Montana. It provides a good example of the promotion of what I would label purposeful confusion. And I quote from the article, "The wood products manufacturing industry today comprises 17% of Montana's economy, second only to the oil and gas industry. A decade ago, wood products were 35%, and 20 years ago, they were half of the Montana economy." That is the wildest exaggeration I have yet to hear about the relative importance of the wood products industry in the Montana economy. If we look simply at the direct contribution of forest products, and I'm talking about forest products here, not just wood products. The article focused on wood products, so I'm including the paper mill we had operating here until relatively recently. The direct contribution of forest products to the income received by Montanans was between 3 and 4% of that total income between 1960 and 1990. Beginning in the mid-1980s, it steadily declined from 3% of total income to less than 1% of total income in 2009. That decline was tied both to the growth in the overall Montana economy and its diversification away from dependence upon land-based natural resource industries, as well as the very real decline in the forest products sector. Consider the magnitude of difference between these sets of figures and the political implications for them. Is the importance of the wood products industry indicated today as a source of 17% of the Montana economy? Or is it 0.8%, which is the direct contribution the forest products industry makes to total personal income being received by Montanans? Back in the year 2000, was it 35% of the Montana economy? Or what the income figures and earning figures indicate, 1.5%. In 1990, 20 years ago, did it really make up half of the Montana economy? Or was it just 2.5% as a source of total personal income in the Montana economy? Now, I'm not including multipliers to get induced and indirect effects into it, but no reasonable set of multipliers can transform the actual direct contribution that forest products has been making to the Montana economy into the figures that were reported in the New York Times on Wednesday. That has political implications. What we might do to protect an industry that's contributing less than 1% to our total income might be quite different than what we might do for an industry that directly contributes 20% or 30% or 50% to our economy. The scale of the intervention, the subsidies that might be justified, would be dramatically different depending on which of these sets of statistics is correct. The fact is our economy is not what it was in 1978 or 88 or 98. We are not going back to the frontier economy some people seem to nostalgically see in the rearview mirror, where extractive industries dominated the economy. And that fact is not tragic. Trying to turn an economy back towards the past is rarely either possible or desirable. The shift in forest management towards managing for biodiversity, recreation, community safety is appropriate given the overall change in our economy and population. Going forward, I'm concerned about the emphasis on healthy forests and sometimes very ambitious proposals for mechanical treatment on a landscape scale in our public forests. Simply because the rest of the nation is not going to be willing to subsidize timber harvests in remote locations the way it did in the past. Federal funds will not be available for ambitious programs to fireproof or insect-proof tens of millions of acres of public forest land. The dollars that have supported and lubricated collaborative management proposals in the past also will not be available to help reduce the need to make trade-offs or accommodations. In that setting, there will be only one source of funds to support these collaborative operations or to support non-commercial operations elsewhere in the forest. And that's going to be harvesting the gift of nature, harvesting the standing inventory of trees, and doing that in a cheap and an efficient manner without planning intensive future management. This need for the harvest of commercially valuable timber to fund other projects will distort necessarily the decisions being made and force them to focus primarily on short-term objectives. That does not leave me very comfortable. This is an unlikely way to make the forests either healthier or, in the long run, our economy healthier. I see us falling back into the conspiracy of optimism that Paul Hertz saw dominating post-World War II U.S. Forest Service policy. The healthy forest concept seems to me to be a recycling of the European forestry tradition that saw all natural forests as chaotic, unproductive, and dangerous. Natural forests needed human management to allow them to become productive and safe. In the past, that view led to the efforts to bring as much public forest land under management by roading them, largely stripping off the existing vegetation and replanting them with superior stock, and then planning to intensively manage them indefinitely into the future. The conspiracy of optimism lay in seeing those timber harvests as supporting all other forest values, creating wildlife habitat, increasing water production to the benefit of fish, farms, and ranches, providing recreational access. Clear cuts were the multiple use miracles. High levels of timber harvest were consistent, we were told, with all other forest values. There was no need to consider trade-offs or make difficult choices. Ecosystem management and biodiversity, as I said, briefly emerged as the focus of forest management, but that quickly shifted into an emphasis on healthy forests and hazardous fuel reductions, both of which I see as a return to 19th century European view of natural systems as chaotic and dangerous and in need of human management. The mistakes and excesses of the past should be encouraging us to take a much more humble, cautious, and local approach to managing public forested landscapes, many of which remain primarily wildlands. We can protect our communities by focusing on the already human-dominated forested landscapes in the vicinities immediately around densely settled areas, and returning to a largely custodial management approach to the distant wildlands. The experience of the last half-century of public lands and the forest management of them should have given us a healthy dose of caution and humility that could save us from another costly conspiracy of optimism. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was very provocative and I guess a good way to kick off this panel. I'm sure some of the legal minds in this room are thinking about the word conspiracy being used. I know it has a couple different connotations, but I'll leave it to you when we get to the question part of it to maybe readdress that with Tom a little bit. Our next panelist is Dan Kemmis, author and former director of the Center of the Rocky Mountain West, so please help me welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start by taking Tom Power up on his invitation to humility. The theme of this panel, Healthy Forests and Healthy Economies, made me acutely aware of the fact that I'm neither a forester nor an economist, nor do I really have any expertise in either arena. To the extent that my experience has given me a perspective on these issues, it comes primarily from the angle of issues of governance and democracy. And so the question that I propose to discuss very briefly is just what form of governance under current conditions is most likely to enable us to move toward healthy forests and healthy economies. And it seems to me that we now have to consider that or any other related question in the context of what's happening with the larger economy. It's, I think, just not possible to think seriously or clearly about how we're going to manage our forested ecosystems without taking account of what's happening to the economy at the global scale and what that means to any system of governance. The commanding fact, it seems to me, now and for the foreseeable future is going to be the imperative of debt reduction. And that's an imperative that not only the United States faces, but essentially every other country in the world. So it's not just a passing issue. And it's not going to go away when the super committee reports in November. It's going to be an ongoing issue. And it's going to affect land management very directly and I think very likely in some pretty severe ways. The worst case scenario that I can think of on that front is the continued use of debt reduction to accomplish fairly narrow political objectives by trying to cut certain activities in land management and other natural resource agencies. I think we'll continue to see efforts along those lines. Personally, I hope that not many of them go very far. But I think the more enduring and broader issue that debt reduction is going to bring to bear is simply an underscoring and a deepening of what has been very clear for a couple of decades now. And that is that there is no way, even with the best of budgets, for existing land management agencies to do the job that has been given to them all by themselves. It just can't be done, and the wise leaders in the agencies have known for some time that it can't be done. And so they have been, some more, some less aggressively, seeking out ways to bring the rest of society to bear on the job of managing the public lands, and in this case, the forests. One of the ways of doing business that it seems to me we're just going to find that we can't afford as we go forward with much tighter budgets is what Chief Bosworth called an analysis paralysis. To the extent that budgets continue to tighten, they have to be used productively. They have to be used on the ground, not in the office, not in lawsuits. So I think we're going to be pushed in the direction of getting much more creative about how to reduce the percentage of scarce agency budgets that is going to, in effect, in the long run, non-productive activity. I don't know how we can do that effectively without pursuing the first strand that I mentioned much more intelligently and much more aggressively than we have so far, and that is figuring out how to involve citizens who want to be involved with problem solving on the forests, who want to be involved in figuring out how to make things work so that we have both healthy forests and healthy economies. We have had now a couple of decades of a pretty extensive experience with mostly locally based collaborations. The one that has received the most attention here is the Beaverhead Deer Lodge collaboration. It, along with a couple of other collaborations, are part of Senator Tester's legislation. The problem is not that we lack the grassroots capacity to do that kind of problem solving. The problem is that we have not even begun to move in the direction of a sensible institutionalization of that capacity. And so we're left with an effort like Senator Tester's, where he introduces a bill in good faith, trying to put in place the results of several of these local collaborations. But within the political context, there's next to no chance of getting that through anytime soon. And there won't be until we create a larger framework for these collaborations to take place in. Now, what I am not advocating here is a wholesale move in the direction of localism. That would, as far as I'm concerned, just be one more fad that we would go chasing after. What I do think we need is an aggressive effort to put in place a framework for experimentation with the most promising forms of local collaboration that can put the democratic capacity that we have in communities across the country much more effectively to work. Along those lines, I brought a little stack of various pamphlets in which I and others have written about these ideas, and I'll put them out for any of you to pick up that might be interested in them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Our next speaker is Leslie Weldon, the Regional Forester here for the Northern Region of the Forest Service. So please help me welcome Leslie.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here today, and I'm also regretting that I wasn't able to be here for other parts of the session. The agenda looked just wonderful with lots of very compelling topics, and I've been hearing that your discussion all along has been rich. I was glad to be here this morning and kind of pick up with into where some of those conversations had gone over the last couple days. So congrats on putting together what is a highly relevant topic, and almost with depths that we could go on forever with, just with the topics that have come up this morning. What I wanted to do was share a little bit about myself, but then go into this, what I see as the contemporary context for forest management, or rather national forest management, national forest and grassland management, and within that, just cue up what I think are so many questions and choices that we need to be responsive to, and that our current activities are making an attempt to do. So I come to you as a person who's worked pretty much my entire adult career with the Forest Service. I'm a biologist by background and training, and I came into the Forest Service way back in the early 80s. 1981 was my first summer job. And it was a time where the agency was probably at the top of its heyday of the developmental production mode, high timber production, high road building, and along with that a high amount of development for recreational opportunities that came with a lot of that access. I reflect back on some of the work I did that first summer, and Deb Austin's in the audience here. She's the forest supervisor on Ololo, and she and I worked on a similar unit. She came right after I left, but a big part of my first job, my very first job, was reforestation surveys. I was a person who would go out into areas that had been harvested. I would be the person who would go and do surveys on the trees that were subsequently planted to see how well they were doing. Back in the days where the reforestation and the care for those trees to produce that next generation of timber were paramount. We made lots of investments of that. Another part of my job in the nights and the evenings was surveying for spotted owls. And so I would go out, my day would start at about 4 in the evening. I'd drive to these areas and sites across the forest that were proposed for harvest activities and do surveys to determine presence, absence, and where these owls were. And to say how far we've come in about 30 years is, I literally had a hand-colored map where we would draw our spotted owl habitat areas. So we're talking pre-GIS, anything like that. And by the end of those days, things were quite sophisticated. I'm saying that just to kind of put in place the amount of change and huge change in focus that has occurred through the years, and that we're still in a place where we as citizens, we have this huge legacy of forest lands, forest and grasslands, not only on the national forest, but across this country, figuring out what we need those lands to do for us. How do we ensure that we're able to keep the level of benefit and function flowing through those, and doing that in the face of very significant changes. Our speaker from Buffalo was talking about a really important issue there, queued up as far as the disposition of so many privately owned lands that are coming to the point where the parents are passing those lands on to their children, and the children are trying to decide, and the children are in their 50s and 60s, whether those lands are something that are going to be a financial burden to them and they should pass on to some other role, or figure out how they can be part of, continuing part of a wild landscape and what to do. So that's a very huge dilemma. Out west here, we have large tracts of land that, our last panel described the rate and pace of change that's occurring with them. And we also have a legacy and a connection between people and landscapes that's continued to evolve with the discussions and the presentation that Tom gave, and the concerns about, what does it mean for us to be effective in managing this public estate with many values into the future. And just to provide a bit of context, we spend time talking quite a bit about that connection between producing wood fiber off of public lands and healthy economy, and I want us to be able to expand that conversation a little bit more. Many of you know, at the height of the timber production years in the Forest Service, which I think crested out in the very early 90s, the National Forest System nationwide was producing 11 billion board feet of timber. This year and next year, that number is 2.4 billion, and next year is proposed to be 2.6 nationwide, and you can hear all that kind of translates out to our landscapes here. So the emphasis and focus has turned to one of acknowledging, in addition to these continuing values and benefits that come to the forest, we have our traditional ones, which have been forage, and I really want us to keep in mind the extent of what would be called grasslands, another significant global ecosystem that is part of the public land space, which is also in peril. So forage, wood fiber, oil and gas production, mining, those extractive type uses. But over the years, dating back to the beginnings of the Forest Service, we're regaining and putting a lot of emphasis into what does it mean to have a healthy, functioning watershed. And I would say, based on our panel earlier and talking about restoration, we had our ecosystem management days where that whole concept of historical condition was something that was a driver, and that was, the thing, and what our scientists were telling us. That's continued to evolve to where the objective is to ensure functioning condition from an ecological standpoint, and there's a range of that. So this idea of kind of going back to, the way things were in 1905 or in, 1805 or before, there's a huge acknowledgement that the function of it is what's most important. How do we ensure the components, the resiliency, to make sure that these lands can keep giving us what we need? So I mentioned clean water, resilient aquatic systems, connecting large wild landscapes, be they public or private, improving habitat quality and understanding that connection between habitat and biological diversity are these pieces that remain critically important, and actually I think must come to the fore if we're really going to define what it means for us to be the kind of stewards we need for these lands that are going to stay public lands into the future and are going to continue to have benefits or contributions not just on the national scale from a healthy people, healthy human community, healthy wild community standpoint, but also making those contributions to economies. All of that's in great flux. We have probably more recreational use occurring on national forests and other public lands than any other time in the past. And I think that's a really great thing. I'm sure, 3/4, if not 100% of the people in this room have public lands, and recreating on public lands is a key part of what they think is important in their life and lifestyles and that of their families. And with that comes, I think, a huge opportunity to keep growing on what does it mean for us to be engaging communities, engaging those citizens in determining the future of these lands, in the face of some pretty overwhelming challenges that these landscapes are going to face. So our work right now really focuses on 3 areas. From an economic standpoint, a lot of our work that we do to improve conditions of forests, with the acknowledgement that our high densities are a key part of our problem, are geared to take on scales that are manageable at this point. And right now, that scale is really driven by not so much how much land we can analyze, but the rate at which we can implement those changes on the ground. We have as much work going into reducing risk of wildfire adjacent to community through mechanical treatments as we do with restoring watersheds by taking care of the road systems, fixing the culverts, and making sure that our hydrologic systems are as healthy as they can in the face of challenges that they'll face in the future. How can we make those more ready to deal with those types of challenges? We also have this continuing huge, and we'll be developing a dollar figure around this, contribution that these forest lands make to communities. We have municipal watersheds that contribute to counties and towns getting clean water. We have firefighting, which really has the benefit when we're in those suppression modes of protecting life and property, and doing that in great partnerships with counties, rural fire districts, and with states. We also have things like transmission lines, hundreds of miles of transmission lines that cross national forests that directly benefit delivery of power, water, gas, a whole bunch of things, which are managed either by public utilities or by private corporations, that are a contribution. We have outfitter and guide businesses that have their direct dependence on national forests, and myriad of other types of direct economic benefits that come from that access and use of the national forests. Add recreation on top of that, and you can see the quite significant sources of economic value that flow from the public land base. We had some speakers talking a little bit earlier, or this might be from a speech I heard yesterday in D.C. that was around secure rural schools. This whole connection and this continuing need to resolve this issue of counties, with large bases of public lands, and how do those counties benefit from that? The basis for that in the past was on direct extraction and productivity, and a return to counties. With secure rural schools coming up for expiring in 2012. What's the next step with that? What is that economic dependence for citizens living in the counties that must be resolved in relation to that? So, these are big questions that need to be resolved at large policy scales, but our work is predominantly happening, from that community basis. And as Dan said, we rely heavily, and we must even do it more in the future, on the engagement of citizens. The local citizens, by extension, acting on behalf of citizens everywhere on the types of choices that we need to make for management of these lands. The challenge is, on the one hand, we have this projected scale of change, sometimes substantial, occurring over the long term and over large landscapes. The acknowledgement has come that our scales of management need to take those things into consideration. I shouldn't say our scales of management, our scales of understanding, and then subsequently convert that into the types of choices for local management on smaller scales that are going to provide the benefits that, our whole diversity of citizenry describes for that. And I think we've done a lot to make progress there, but we have a lot and a long way to go. The experiences that we've had in Montana and Idaho really lay a good framework for exploring how far do we take these collaboratives. Do we need to have a different, and as Dan mentioned as well, some kind of institutionalized context for citizen engagement in managing public lands, national forest lands? Is that going to buy us something? In the face of the amount of opportunity that we have for, where appropriate and where with that public agreement to go and do treatments, of whatever kind, how do we expand the resources available for that? Coming back from D.C. this week, we talked about our budgets for the next couple of years. USDA, where the Forest Service resides, will likely see a 5% decrease this year, and then on top of that, likely a 5% again next year. And that has direct impact on our capacity, to get that analysis work done, to field people, to collect data, to enable us to stand up those activities and projects and get them done. That's real. So what do we need to do to expand out, being optimistic? If our resources are going down internally, how can we, as a federal agency, maximize the leverage of those funds that we do have to get as much work done as we can? We have great partnerships now. They're making a huge difference for us, but how do we take that box even farther to say, those recreationists, how can we harness their interest, their understanding, and their ability to make choices to help? Where and how do we need to look at other sources and really growing the amount of external contribution to be able to make the appropriated dollar go farther? There's a lot of effort going into evaluating how corporations or businesses and other large foundations at much larger financial scales might be able to make a difference. And those are all conversations that we need to have. So just to put us in a place to queue up some questions and concerns, I wanted to put that out there. And I look forward to the discussion that we'll have around that. And I'll just get my buddy John up here to make his remarks. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Leslie. That was a nice segue. Thank you. I just wanted to comment that I loved the quote from Robert Louis Stevenson that was in the invitation to participate in the panel. And I've been to his, I don't know if you know, of course we love Treasure Island and we love A Child's Garden of Verse. I mean, if you haven't read Treasure Island out loud to your kids and they're small, it's just totally cool. Long John Silver is one of the best characters. But what you may not know is that the last years of his life were spent in the South Pacific and Western Samoa, where he's revered as an advocate for Polynesian sovereignty and worked very hard using his reputation to try to convince, and to some extent successfully, that European countries should stay out and let island people run their own countries and places. So interesting man. And a wonderful grave site overlooking the rainforest and Pacific. I work for the Montana Wilderness Association, which was started 53 years ago to protect Montana's vanishing wilderness heritage. And keeping our state's wilderness heritage requires commitment. Wilderness designation is the goal because it's the strongest legal commitment that we can secure through the democratic process to ensure that our wild lands, these special places, will remain wild and untrammeled, and we can pass them from generation to generation. It's a powerful thing. It's a democratic thing. Wilderness works. The Wilderness Act has stood the test of time. It's been accused of all kinds of things, and all we need to do is go out and look at our wonderful wilderness areas to see how effectively it works. It's part of the fabric of our public lands, and it's defined by law as multiple use. It belongs in our mountains along with areas managed for other uses. Unfortunately, Montana has fallen far behind nearly every other state with significant remaining wildlands in completing the process of securing protection for those deserving lands. In the last 25 years, Congress has designated 490 wilderness areas in 29 other states, but nothing for Montana. Yet, Montana is our home, and we know it's a big, beautiful state, blessed with many areas that deserve the highest level of protection that we as Americans can provide it to pass on. The great news is that after years of inaction by our congressional delegation, we have a bill that would break this gridlock that's awaiting passage in the U.S. Senate, thanks to the leadership of Senator Tester. The Forest Jobs and Recreation Act is the most constructive, the most creative, compelling, built by Montanans collaboratively, and the most viable public lands bill that we've seen in decades. And it makes real the best and brightest ideas that Montanans working together, and by that I mean people from very different points of view that all have a stake in our management of our public lands, for management and conservation of those lands. It's supported by conservation groups, the Montana Wilderness Association, Trout Unlimited, National Wildlife Federation, many others, most of the remaining sawmills in the state, and it's supported by hunting, fishing, by labor, and by the Chamber of Commerce. So it has very broad bipartisan support. Now, it does several things, and since I'm a wilderness guy, I left my wilderness hat on the floor because it was filthy after the last trail project. I'm going to start with wilderness. Passage of this bill will designate 19 new wilderness areas from some of the most beautiful wildlands in Montana. Along the Continental Divide, the Centennials, Lima Peaks, Italian Peaks, the West Big Hole, along a great arc of the divide. And it will safeguard great Montana gems like the Pioneers, the Snowcrests, the Ruby Mountains, the Sapphires, in the headwaters of Rock Creek. It will expand the Mission Mountains, the Scapegoat Wilderness, the Anaconda Pintler, and the Lee Metcalf for the first time since their designation. And it will wrap places like Grizzly Basin in the Swan Range and Montour Creek, recommended by the U.S. Forest Service 26 years ago. Talk about unfinished business. It'll wrap those in the protection of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where they belong. It also designates a series of special recreation areas and special management areas, nearly all, probably all of which came to this bill through the collaborative process, that will protect them as backcountry, will prohibit development, will prohibit roads, but will allow things like mountain biking, snowmobiling, some OHV use on legal trails, but not roads and development. So, and that's for areas like other parts of the West Big Hole, much of the West Pioneers, the Tobacco Roots, Lost Creek Canyon and Northwest Peaks, to name a few of them. And that's not all this bill does. This bill also gives the Forest Service new management tools, stewardship projects developed through collaboration to accomplish more work and much needed work in the roaded national forest areas. It'll provide statutory direction that enables the Forest Service to ramp up treatment of roaded public lands that need work. Restoring healthy watersheds by reducing sediment pollution. This nearly always means reducing road densities. Restoring excellent habitat conditions for trout and wildlife. Again, targeting areas that have far too many roads on the landscape, and destructive roads, and roads that are unplanned, that crisscross the creek, that go up the mountainside, that deliver sediments and pollution into our streams and ruin the ability of that land to sustain healthy herds of elk and other wildlife, all of which road densities diminish when they get to be too much. Now, it's not removing all the roads, but it's reducing road densities. That's an important conservation purpose. So ramping up treatment, restoring healthy watersheds, reducing sediment pollution, restoring excellent fish and wildlife habitat, preventing and treating noxious weeds, and reducing hazardous fuels with a focus and emphasis on homes, areas near homes and communities, the wildland-urban interface. This makes so much sense. It makes so much sense in so many ways. Last May, at the Senate hearing on this bill, Senator Wyden, the chairman of the Public Lands Subcommittee in the Senate, praised the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act and called this kind of approach in this title the forestry of the New West. So this is not the days of Champion and Plum Creek clear cutting. It's not the days when the Forest Service was building road after road after road. When I lived in the Swan Valley, there were hundreds of miles of roads being built. Every year, roads were being built into formerly wild country. It's not about any of that at all. In fact, the bill prohibits new road construction because we don't need more roads. Anyway, the fact is, this forestry, these roaded lands need work, and it's best accomplished through a landscape level and the vehicle of stewardship projects, so they can be restored after years of neglect, actually, and not purposeful neglect. And these are not wildlands. These are primarily lands that have been logged to some extent. They've been roaded, and they have conditions that really require active management to bring them up to the condition that we would like to see our public lands in. Healthier conditions. I think it's important to emphasize that these tools didn't just appear in a Senate bill, but were built from years and years of work, and Dan knows this well, by Montanans, by loggers and conservationists working together, going back at least into the Flathead Forestry Project in the 1990s. At that time, those people working in the Flathead Forestry Project became frustrated with the old federal timber sale model because they wanted to build the right kinds of treatments from the ground up with a heavy emphasis on restoration and treating fish, wildlife, watersheds, as well as forest conditions. So they created this concept that was different than a timber sale. Instead of selling timber, they would focus on the conditions that you want to produce on the land so that commercial products, saw logs, post and poles would be a byproduct. And so they wrote the first forest stewardship bill in 1994. I have a copy of it. It was introduced by Representative Williams. It never got a hearing. It never got a hearing in the beginning because Plum Creek and they didn't like empowering the loggers. It was kind of interesting. And then later there was this kind of big environmental groups. But I think over time people have come to realize this is a tremendous vehicle for the kind of treatments that we need on our forests, and it's a tremendous vehicle for collaboration. And for broad-based support for getting work accomplished. So the stewardship bill didn't get a hearing, but it gained an important ally when they went out in the field with then regional forester Dale Bosworth. Dale became convinced of its merit, and when he had the chance, he asked the Senate for authority to do 9 pilot stewardship projects, including the Clearwater Project on the Lolo. And the results were so promising that Congress later provided national authorization. Now there's an example of the stepping stone where good local ideas can open the door to good national leadership. And I think it's good that that kind of leadership should come from Montana. So the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act in Title I applies the stewardship concept to large forest landscapes. It places strong emphasis on restoration, prioritizes fuel treatments. The projects must meet science-based standards for grizzlies, elk, and native fish for restoration of impaired waters and wildlife habitats, and it must meet the maximum road density standards of 1.5 million. The measure of accountability, there is accountability built in, but it's not timber volume or timber cut, but acres treated. And former Chief Dale Bosworth called acres treated, quote, exactly the right measure for the kind of work that needs to be accomplished. And I think that means a lot coming from Dale. So, jobs. Leslie mentioned broadening the conversation about jobs, and since I'm a wilderness guy with a dirty wilderness hat on the floor, I'll start with wilderness jobs, which is, and I'll start by saying that every aspect of this bill, the wilderness designations, the backcountry recreation areas, and the Title I stewardship and restoration treatments will provide sustained jobs, different kinds of jobs, and will help rural communities, and will help improve conditions on our forest. So amazingly, there's still some that allege, despite all these years of great editorials, that wilderness doesn't benefit the economy. In February 2000, Montana partnered with Montana businesses to complete and publish a comprehensive survey of small tourism businesses that are permitted to operate on public lands in Montana. We found 306 Montana businesses at that time that depended directly on roadless areas, designated wilderness, or both. Generated $107 million in new economic activity, 4,000 jobs, much of that starting in rural communities where most of these businesses are located. So this is good. Wilderness and backcountry areas, keeping those are good for, and those business owners told us over and over and over, because we did this as a partnership, that they have to compete with other parts of the world. They said, we can only do that by offering a high-quality outdoor experience, the very kind of high-quality experience that wilderness protects. One surprising finding was that nearly half of all their service days were in unprotected wilderness or roadless areas or backcountry areas, including 16 areas that would be proposed, that are proposed for wilderness or backcountry recreation under the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. So passage of this bill will retain the high quality and allow those businesses to compete and bring jobs and income starting in rural communities. It also protects mountain tracts as wilderness or backcountry in the headwaters where it makes the most sense, the headwaters of Rock Creek, the headwaters of the Big Hole, the headwaters of the Madison. Are these important to Montana's economy? You're damn right they are. That's why Trout Unlimited is a partner and a strong supporter. The stewardship provisions will also allow us in areas like the Beaverhead Deer Lodge and the Lolo to restore and improve conditions for trout and aquatic health. So the quality of those, Fish, Wildlife and Parks estimates, hunting and fishing, their numbers are like $530 billion. Now, I don't know how much of that is from this exactly, but it's an important thing. All right, skilled jobs in the woods and mills. Last year, the Yale School of Forestry published a study of the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, and it showed that the stewardship provisions in Title I would help stabilize and keep 630 existing jobs in the mills and woods, and it would allow us to add another 240 new jobs on the Lolo and Beaverhead Deer Lodge Forest to accomplish this needed forest stewardship work. Last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, I was out with Tim on a tour, and Senator Tester, and other members of the Seeley Lake community on a tour of a project like this, the Augie Project. And so what kind of jobs were they? Well, you see people out there working in these kind of projects. They're loggers, heavy equipment operators, mill workers, log haulers, biologists, U.S. Forest Service employees. This is good work in rural communities. These are skilled jobs. This is not hamburger flipping that someone used to talk about. By the way, we shouldn't make the mistake of overlooking, and Leslie alluded to this in terms of the budget, the pivotal role of skilled Forest Service. We need a skilled and professional workforce as much as we need skilled woods workers, or we won't be able to do this work. And many of those jobs are located in rural communities. So in sum, passage of the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act will protect 19 of Montana's most beautiful wild areas, sustaining jobs and businesses. It'll retain existing jobs. That's reversing the trend, by the way. Retain existing jobs in Montana mills and woods and allow us to add new skilled workers, particularly in woods work. And it will allow us to reinvest in our fish and wildlife habitats. So the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act combines the best ideas of Montanans into a transformative vision of conservation and public land. And I believe that this bill, made in Montana by Montanans, will pass. And it certainly deserves the support of every member of the state's congressional delegation. So thank you.
Are there microphones out in the audience? What's that? Are there microphones out in the audience, or should I take this one out?
I can take that one out.
Okay, I'm sure you've got some really pent-up questions here for our panelists, and John's going to bring out the microphone and get us started.
Hi, this is a question for Tom Powers. If the forest products industry amounts to only a single-digit percentage of the Montana economy, I'm wondering what the percentage of the economy would be if we moved to more of a custodial role for the Forest Service and emphasize forest recreation. What percentage does forest recreation of all sorts contribute to the economy?
Push. Ah, follow directions. Measuring percentages always involves relative importance. Measuring relative importance always involves aggregating certain sectors of the economy, as I was doing with logging, forestry, wood products manufacturing, paper manufacturing, and then comparing it to some measure of the total economy. The problem with tourism is that it's not a single industry, which is why we have an organization over in the School of Forestry that has to do annual surveys to try and get some sort of measure of what part of retail sales, what part of gasoline sales, et cetera, is associated with particular types of recreation. So I can't give you a number because it involves taking what the total tourist impact is and trying to parse out that part that's associated with public lands. But what I will say is that a substantial part of the economic impact associated with public lands is not tied to the visitor economy or what we usually call tourism. It's tied to residents engaging in recreational activities on Forest Service land, and it's tied to the fact that those public lands provide us with the background against which we live our lives. It's what helps define Montana, especially western Montana, and makes it an attractive place to live, work, do business. When that approach is taken, I would argue that those forest lands, even if managed primarily in a custodial form, would continue to provide almost all of the economic benefits that they're currently providing, that there would not be a decrease. Let me just leave it at that.
I also have a money question for you, Tom. I had hoped we would talk a little bit more about natural capital and kind of the aspects of our forests or our forests that we don't assign money to, say like the price of a biodiversity or a healthy river. Do you think that Forest Service commodities are fairly priced on the market to reflect their total cost?
The commodity price isn't tied, as we know, to what it costs the U.S. Forest Service to engage in the management activities that it does. The commodity cost is determined by simply supply and demand in the market, and the answer there is no, that the social cost or environmental cost associated with managing lands for timber often is not reflected in that. Now, one could argue that because that one of the reasons for analysis paralysis has been the efforts of citizens to get the Forest Service to take into account the costs and minimize the costs associated with managing the forests. And that it's that has consumed more and more of their budget. I'm not sure that's at all a waste in the sense that it is an effort to get those broader environmental costs or natural capital costs present when decisions are being made about how to manage a particular tract of land. So in an indirect way, the Forest Service's budget and the distribution of that budget does reflect the concern over the fact that there are significant costs that ordinarily aren't taken into account.
Could I add something on to that? And I think you're exactly right as far as how do we truly account for and then measure what success means for public lands. At a meeting I was at earlier this week, we were talking about this, and I don't have the example and the numbers for Montana, but the regional forester for California expressed that they have come up with numbers, and I don't know, how we're all put together and such, but this is how they told the story as they went to talk with county government, state government about the role and value of public lands and the need to really work together on them. So, and this is California. The value of the water that flows off of national forests that is of service to citizens, added in with the value of the wood fiber in whatever forms, from biomass to saw logs and everything in between, and the value of recreation associated with national forest was assigned a value of $29 billion. And the rest of the argument went that right now the Forest Service in that state invests approximately $100 million on an annual basis into resource management. I think that's taking, the piece of the budget that's actually doing, providing services on the ground and doing restoration work and all of those things to protect a $29 billion investment, and that's not getting it. If you measure the impact of change or loss that could come to having clean water, to being able to provide those other benefits, that's the dilemma. Then on top of that, California, depending on what year, over the last 10 years, has spent between $200 and $800 million suppressing wildfires adjacent to communities and to protect those values. So the question becomes, how do we really ascribe values to water, to the outcomes of a functioning watershed, to the backdrop values that Tom had mentioned earlier as part of that equation for the value of the investments we make to protect it. And I would like for us to be able to get those same numbers, that we agree on how they're put together and such, and be able to express that for public lands and maybe even the public and private, wildlands in Montana and Idaho, to have those same types of conversations. So thanks for letting me add on to that. That's why I went and got my notes. I thought I got some numbers.
You guys are being way too easy. A couple more questions.
So if you were to reevaluate the contribution of the forest or the value of the forest, would you then also look at reallocation formulas for PILT and secure rural schools?
So I'm a public servant, and that's a policy question for sure, but I think that type of information needs to be part of the mix. The past was about direct revenue generation and how that got translated based on how society at large captured the value coming off of public lands. Now the question is, what is the inherent value of the various ecological services on top of the direct economic benefits that need to be considered, and what should that mean for states and counties? So we need to be able to add that into the equation, and I'm not sure at this point how that will occur. There may be other folks in the room who know, as we're looking at this next phase, at least of the Secure Rural Schools and Community Determination Act expiring in 2013.
What I would add is that those, if you want background values, are things that some of the people most worried about the flow of funds from the Forest Service to local governments tend to ignore. They don't see the benefits flowing from the forest directly to their residents, to their businesses, to their communities. And only see the negative aspect, namely that they can't tax the land, and therefore it's not part of the tax base that can support the provision of public services. And I'm not sure exactly how to get out of the situation we got ourselves into. Initially, the more timber was harvested, the more local governments got. And so it was the clear cutting for kids situation where local governments were encouraged to be single-mindedly focused on the extractive aspects of the benefits that national forest, public forest could provide. We tried to move away from that by allocating those funds on a basis that wasn't tied to timber harvest and would stabilize those revenues. I think we need to find a way of, in some fair way, weaning local areas off of that reliance on Washington, D.C. for substantial flows. It becomes quite inequitable in terms of what counties get what. If you tie it to timber harvest, a lot of Montana economies got very little because there was never very much, despite having very large, extensive national forest land. As it is now, states with mineral deposits on Forest Service land get significant flows of revenues, or at least the state government does, and often feeds those back. So we're in a crazy situation where payments to county governments or state governments and local governments often are only tied to the cash flows associated with the management of the public lands, and not to the broader range of benefits that are being obtained.
I wanted to tie a couple things because I participate now in partner with Foresters and BLM, and we're working with the Continental Divide Trail Alliance and mountain bikers, equestrians, and others to try to, we actually want to increase the capacity of the Forest Service to provide trails, to maintain trails. And what you start to realize is sources of funding are scarce. The benefits, as Tom points out, are tremendous to local communities. Whether they realize it or not, they will realize it. But nearly every source of funding that we currently tap for these is under siege right now. Everyone is, as a matter of fact. RTP funds, that's under question. AmeriCorps, a wonderful program, totally on the chopping block. Trail funding, and then the Secure Rural Schools, that's up for renewal next year. And if we don't do these things, and we talk about a custodial role, and I don't know what that means, but when some people talk about it, it means that things aren't happening. And I think that if you want good management, and you want quality recreation, and you want good visitor contact and good trail management, whether it's in the wilderness or behind Helena in the South Hills on the Helena National Forest, it takes money. And we need to fund these programs. These are all good programs that leverage benefits. And we in Montana, our entire delegation should be pushing for these. And I'm not sure why they're not, but they should be, because these are very good for rural economies. And without these things, we're going to be losing. We're going to start to see a deterioration rapidly. And so I just want to say that these things are all in jeopardy right now, and they're all important to our communities and our ability, the ability of land managers to provide the values that we increasingly demand in terms of recreation.
I would just add that the concept of custodial management would affect where activities are engaged in, not whether activities are engaged in. It might affect whether you try to engage in landscape scale activities or focus the activities to where they're more appropriate and more likely to be effective.
I'm Rob Cheney from the Missoulian. John, I'll direct this at you, but I'd be interested in the whole panel. In your review of Tester's bill, you went through the timber harvest forest restoration part. But just this morning, we've heard, among other things, the Forest Service predicting limited budgets in coming years that are going to directly affect its ability to take on new projects. We've heard that long-term commitments to forest management could fly directly in the face of climate change, fast-changing on-the-ground conditions. And we've heard questions about existing treatment ideas and whether or not they actually do create forest restoration. I'd be curious to your thoughts on how that bill adapts to the challenges that the other speakers this morning have presented to forest management.
Yeah, I think it actually is an important tool. It's not the only tool, and funding is important also. And I also am an advocate of, in fact, we do need to treat it at landscape level. That may mean many small projects, but it's so cool to go out and start to work at the ground level, pre-scoping with the Forest Service, with the biologists, to look at, how we can restore fish passages at a landscape level, for example. And when you look at fire or wildlife, you really need to be looking at it at the landscape level to have an effect that's meaningful. And I think that's why we're totally on board that. In terms of climate change, there's sort of an implication that what's the use? I don't know. I don't want to read that into your question, Rob, but I certainly think that the evidence of climate change is all around us and needs to be dealt with in terms of how we're affecting it as humans. But that's a macro scale. And meanwhile, we need to be able to treat areas near homes and communities. And to do that, I don't think that means that you're not going to have fire. I learned this from professionals like Tim. It means that when you have fire, that the fire people will have more ability to manage that fire so it's less destructive to homes and property. And that's always going to be important. That's not going to become less important. And all you have to do as I did this morning and drive over McDonald Pass to see, and it's disheartening, really. And I believe it is symptomatic of climate. I believe the scale of it is symptomatic of our changing climate. But we have a sea of dead trees. And if you go out with people, professionals, you see it's not just one insect. And I think basically all of the east side, which is on the margin of conifers in Montana, you see lots of spruce budworm. You see it having an impact that you might have seen it in past years, but now, especially after the 10 years of drought, and pine beetle, of course. So we need to be able to treat those things and prioritize those treatments and do it in the urban interface and do it at a scale that's meaningful. And it won't have that effect overnight. And also, it doesn't mean that you won't have fire. In fact, all the research shows that vegetative management, you need to burn it when you're done. It needs to burn, that the two things are necessary. So, I think it's a really important tool. It's not the only tool. Funding will be important to carry these things out.
Thanks, John. I'm going to give the
All right.
panelists just a minute to respond to Rob's question.
Okay, yeah, Leslie, what I would add on to that is, we do have a lot of things we're going to face that we've never faced before as climate change continues to manifest itself. We're in the middle of it now. There's a lot that we're seeing. But people are still going to need things from these lands. And the nexus of humans with those systems is going to continue to be really key. And as John was saying, that translates into things that are happening more at the local and the near-term scale. So that even while we need to be aware and take on truly what it means to manage in an adaptive fashion across those macro scales, there's still needs and opportunities, and I think the ability for these systems to support providing the things that people need, on the one hand. On the other hand, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of wildfire. A big shift that the Forest Service is in the midst of has been this acknowledgement that our ability to have wildfire play that role in increasing the amount of resiliency and ability for diversity in structure across the landscape is something that we need to use to our benefit. And we're incorporating that actively into our practices of managing wildfires when they occur. I got an update just the other day. As of Tuesday, for the fires that our region is managing, we had about just under 70, and around 60 of only 2 of those were in a full all-out suppression mode. They're in the wrong place. This fire needs to go out. 6 of them had a limited suppression approach, and fully 30 of them, and this isn't, breaking them down by number of acres or that, were fires that we were looking at in managing to take advantage of what they can do to actually build some additional resiliency and change some of those conditions on the landscape. And that's going to continue to be an important way that we use that tool, even as we look in the near country, the interface at having more mechanical treatments that can get some conditions changed much more quickly. And our forest, the new planning rule has a real emphasis and focus on using that whole suite of approaches that are going to be very important for western wildlands in particular, which are so fire dependent, as both a way of improving, having conditions change and adjust in such a way that in the long term are going to increase the amount of resiliency on those large landscapes.
Thanks, Leslie. How about you, Dan? Did you have any closing remarks, or how about you, Tom? Anything to add?
I would just add that the funding level that's going to be available is going to be much, much lower. Choices are going to have to be made. Wishful, optimistic thinking about all the things we might do just is not going to be very useful. Very hard choices focusing on the highest priority items where we know or are pretty sure we know what we're doing is where we're going to have to focus our efforts as opposed to looking across the entire forested landscape and imagining, in a Faustian sort of dream that we know enough to manage those natural systems. We can't afford it. We don't know enough to do it. We have to be a lot more humble and cautious than that.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be up here with everybody today. You had a really wonderful conference. Wish I could have attended more of it. One last round of applause for our panelists.
All right. My name is Dave Wisnan, and I'm one of the conference editors. I'd just like to say a few thanks before I hand it over to Ray Cross for the closing remarks. I'd just like to thank all the members of the Law Review for all their hard work putting this conference on, as well as last year's conference editors, Brad Dixon, Jen Hillhart, and Tracy Neighbor, and our faculty advisors, Jack Tuhalski and Raymond Cross, for all their support. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ray Cross for brief closing remarks.
First of all, I'd like to thank the conference editors, the staff, and all the panelists that made this such a wonderful conference. I really am heartened by the comments that I heard. Let me just take 5 minutes, and perhaps there'll be some comments from the audience as well. I think the way you should think of this conference is, can public land law, and this is expressed here as a new forest planning rule, really function as the Swiss Army knife of a new forest law that adequately responds to new, growing, emergent threats, climate change, species loss and extinction, urban sprawl, population growth, job demands, scientific incompleteness and uncertainty, managerial intransigence and inertia. And I think we've heard two competing and perhaps opposed viewpoints on this possible new forest law that responds to the Swiss Army knife of these challenges. And I'd like to just say, with apologies up front, I'm going to personify those in the character of two of our speakers, Charles Wilkinson and Jack Ward Thomas. I consider Chuck to be a real advocate for law, possibilities of law, the redemptive power of law, the visionary character of law. And I think he'd say, yes, we can. Yes, we can. We can have a new forest law. We can have a new planning rule that really responds to all of these challenges, that addresses climate change, species loss, extinction, jobs demands. And then I think on the other side, we have the opposite point of view. We have a Jack Ward Thomas. He says, no, we can't. Any hope for a new forest law, a new forest rule that trumps the political trade-offs that will be coming, the severe budget constraints, the lack of funding for monitoring and assessment, the radical incompleteness of science, the volatility of nature witnessed by the barred owl replacing the spotted owl in the Cascade forests, is sort of a self-delusion. You just can't get there from law. My takeaway is that both Chuck Wilkinson, Jack Ward Thomas are both right and wrong. Chuck Wilkinson is right that we do need a new forest law. And we need a new forest law that mimics the challenges that we face next 20, 30, 40 years. And though some of us, perhaps Jack Ward Thomas, might characterize this new forest grammar that Martin and I spoke about, landscape level planning, ecosystem services, collaboration, adaptive management. Jack Ward Thomas might say, others might say, these are fine buzzwords and bumper stickers, but they don't have any scientific meaning or any real on-the-ground applicability given the biological uncertainty and incompleteness and lack of funding. So instead, we need something much less ambitious. Now, what's the possibilities to think beyond law? Given the fact that we're at a law conference, given the fact we're talking about forest law, given the fact we're talking about a planning rule, we're kind of perhaps too law obsessed. Let me suggest that we heard also non-law approaches. And let me recall what Adam Smith had to say so many years ago in Wealth of Nations. The market is smarter than any group of legislators. Trust the market. Think about new approaches to dealing with climate change. Think about cap and trade. Think about emission sales on the market. Think about the market that's self-healing, self-correcting, and perfect. Not lawyers, not legislators, not planners. Think about a new law at a new level, talking about this, of a world forest law. A law framed by global conventions, Kyoto, Copenhagen, other forest conventions that'll be coming, climate conventions. Think about a law that transcends the narrow boundaries of local sovereignty, imposes a vision at the appropriate, as they say, macro scale of the challenge that we can't deal with in any sense of the word, either locally or nationally. Third, should we despair? And I think the answer is something like this: at the long level and the long duration of real intervals, at the levels of the lives of forests, geological periods, we don't have to worry. We've seen again and again the resilience of nature. Nature is healer. Nature, as in a sense, better than man at deciding what's needed. So at the long level, I don't think either Jack Ward Thomas or Chuck Wilkinson have to worry. Nature will be here long after this. And finally, even if we're driven to the desperate straits by budget deficit reduction, we always have options the law and economist types from the Chicago School would say, basically monetize the forests, auction them off. You can get billions of dollars out of all of the national assets. We can close the budget gaps, and we can do it better in private hands. So those are other options. And finally, I really enjoyed Jack Ward Thomas's comments to say, you can reduce the forest law from hundreds, perhaps thousands of pages, incomprehensible scientese, legalese, bureaucracies, down to leave the damn forest alone. So if all else fails, we'll simply have to get Jack Ward Thomas to write the new forest law with big bumper sticker, leave these damn forests alone. So I'd like to ask any of you if you have advice for the Public Land Law Review, what focus should they have? Was this a good conference? These kinds of things that are less legal, more perhaps sentimental and emotional. Any comments to add to what you've heard so far in a wonderful conference? If not, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the students of Public Land Law Review. I want to thank you as the audience that really makes us come alive, makes it meaningful to everyone. I'd like to thank all the panelists that contributed their intellectual and emotional power. And I'd like to see you again at another Public Lands Law Conference. So I thank you on behalf of the Law Review, the Law School, all the panelists. So thank you.